You know, there isn't a person sitting in this room right now who, after hearing today's scripture from John, the story of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, hasn't said to yourself, yeah, I can't relate to that. We've all had a death in a family, or a bad accident that happened, or something financial, or losing your job, or war, or shootings at school. And we cry out and say, where are you, God? Where were you, God? And then you go through the litany of the ifs. Well, if you were here, or if I did this, or if you saw this. You know, for every person in this room who has ever been overwhelmed by the power of darkness, God is saying to you, I'm right here. And I know. And I feel your sadness. And I'm here to speak hope and life back into you. So as you're sitting here today, my prayer is that you ask God to help you to believe in life after death, in hope after despair, in a better future when we're in crisis and you can't see, and to ask God to give you the faith to trust Him in the good times and the bad. When peace like...
A reading from John chapter 11. A certain man, Lazarus, was ill. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This was the Mary who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, saying, Lord, the one whom you love is ill.
When he heard this, Jesus said, this illness isn't fatal. It's for the glory of God, so that God's Son can be glorified through it. Jesus loved Martha, her sister, and Lazarus. When he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed where he was. After 2 days, he said to his disciples, let's return to Judea again.
The disciples replied, Rabbi, the Jewish opposition wants to stone you, but you want to go back?
Jesus answered, aren't there 12 hours in a day? Whoever walks in the day doesn't stumble because they see the light of the world. But whoever walks in the night does stumble because the light isn't in them. He continued, our friend Lazarus is sleeping, but I'm going in order to wake him up.
The disciples said, Lord, if he's sleeping, he will get well. They thought Jesus meant that Lazarus was in a deep sleep, but Jesus had spoken about Lazarus' death.
Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died. For your sakes, I'm glad I wasn't there, so that you can believe. Let's go to him.
Then Thomas, the one called Didymus, said to the other disciples, let us go too, so that we may die with Jesus.
When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was a little less than 2 miles from Jerusalem.
Many Jews had come to comfort Martha and Mary after their brother's death. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went to meet him, while Mary remained in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Even now, I know that whatever you ask God, God will give you.
Jesus told her, your brother will rise again.
Martha replied, I know that he will rise in the resurrection on the last day.
Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, even though they die. Everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?
She replied, Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, God's Son, the one who is coming into the world. After she said this, she went and spoke privately to her sister Mary. The teacher is here, and he's calling for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. He hadn't entered the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were comforting Mary in the house saw her get up quickly and leave, they followed her. They assumed she was going to mourn at the tomb. When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died.
When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, Where have you laid him?
They replied, Lord, come and see.
Jesus began to cry. The Jews said, See how much he loved him? But some of them said, He healed the eyes of the man born blind. Couldn't he have kept Lazarus from dying? Jesus was deeply disturbed again when he came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stove covered the entrance. Jesus said, "Remove the stone."
Martha, the sister of the dead man, said, "Lord, the smell will be awful. He's been dead 4 days."
Jesus replied, "Didn't I tell you that if you believe, you will see God's glory?" So they removed the stone. Jesus looked up and said, "Father, thank you for hearing me. I know you always hear me. I say this for the benefit of the crowd standing here, so that they will believe that you sent me." Having said this, Jesus shouted with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his feet bound and his hands tied, and his face covered with a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Untie him and let him go."
Thank you. Please join me in prayer. In this moment of reflection, Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our heart be acceptable before you. For you are our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. In recent weeks, I've heard that some of you are wondering why the lengthy Bible readings. It has to do with this. The gospel writer John is a brilliant storyteller. And by telling the complete story, he puts us right in the midst of what is happening. We can see and hear the conversation. We can ponder the implication for our own lives. John chapter 11 puts us among the eyewitnesses who saw Jesus confronting the depth of human sorrow, felt by the sisters, Mary and Martha, the neighbors, and himself. Upon learning of his friend Lazarus' illness and realizing the man has died, Jesus and the disciples made the long trek from the Galilean region down to Bethany, located on the southeastern slope of the Mount of Olives near Jerusalem. Jesus would not make the return trip. Just as his disciples feared, religious authorities wanted to kill him, and even more so after he restored Lazarus to life. Before the miracle, the anguished Jesus declared to grief-stricken Martha, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever has faith in me, even if he should die, shall live. And whoever lives and has faith in me most certainly does not die throughout the age." The most far-reaching promise anywhere in the gospel. Jesus then asks, "Do you have faith in this?" This morning, I will tell how one person is trying to answer. And I hope you recognize the promise Jesus gave in John 11 addresses the way we live right now. Our faith is grounded in the reality of God's love, and a love that prevails over everything. A love that not even death can separate us from. Thus, Jesus makes it possible for you and me to face tragedy, to face death. Oh yes, we still feel the impact, the pain, the sorrow, but that does not diminish the promise Jesus made. And for myself, I need to hear that promise again, especially in the week of another school shooting. Kate Bowler was a talented young professor at Duke University, a mother of a newborn. She had a magnificent marriage. Then she got cancer. I first learned about Dr. Bowler when two of her students was in one of my classes at Southern Seminary doing their Lutheran year. They spoke of her wonderful ways to make, of all topics, church history come alive. In February 2016, Bowler wrote about her cancer experience for the New York Times Sunday Review. On a Thursday morning a few months ago, I got a call from my doctor's assistants telling me that I have stage 4 cancer. The stomach cramps I was suffering from were not caused by a faulty gallbladder, but by a massive tumor. I am 35. I did the things you might expect of someone whose world has suddenly become very small. I sank to my knees and cried. Later, she muses, "Cancer has kicked down the walls of my life. I cannot be certain I will walk my son to his elementary school. I struggle to buy books for academic projects. Cancer requires that I stumble around in the debris of my dreams I thought I was entitled to, and plans I didn't realize I made." When someone gets knocked down by tragic circumstances, school shooting, automobile accident, loss of employment, unfaithful spouse, or medical diagnosis, where does that person find hope or meaning? Can light break through that pall of darkness, or faith squeeze its way into thoughts now overflowing with hurt and dominated by images of death? 2 weeks ago, Kate Bowler's book was released. Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Believed. It blends her experience with cancer and her research into a peculiar American aberration of Christianity. Bowler is an expert on what is called prosperity gospel. She defines prosperity gospel as the belief that God gives health and wealth to those with the right kind of faith. Hence the question from Kate and others who struggle. What if we are not healthy? What if we are not wealthy? Does that mean we have the wrong kind of faith? Prosperity gospel gathers hundreds of thousands of adherents because it addresses these elementary human desires, but its proclamation comes with a two-edged sword. The blessing side constantly offers believers motivation to keep trying, wrapped in testimony by ordinary folks and proclaimed by captivated preachers, is the message: you can do it. Everything is going to work out. As Bowler points out, yeah, that's what folks want to hear, especially when things are so terrible and you want to feel like this day is not entirely defined by a drug I can't control or a doctor I think I hate, by all the factors that you just have no control over. But there's another side to those theologies. When things don't go the way desired, the shaming finger points and the guilt builds because the primary person to blame is always you. The resurrection promise Jesus gave to Martha confronts this false message that receiving a blessing depends upon your having the correct thoughts. For Kate Bowler, whose diagnosis forced her to face the truth, we're all going to die, including me, the notion of resurrection means there is freedom in knowing my limits and knowing the frailty of my body. She continues, the part that precedes the resurrection is the death, right? And part of the beauty of coming to the end of yourself and the reality you might not be quite as special or quite as original as you imagine is the part where you end and God begins. And then you can say, man, the best part about me is not me, is it? It is the new thing that God is always doing. And in the midst of decay, in terrible and hospital world, in needles, there remained the sense that God can make things new with or without me. According to Bowler, the only outrageous certainty we have is the promise Jesus made. The gospel writer John brings the reader face to face with what relationship with Jesus offers those who embrace it. It is the gift, lived in the moment and fulfilled when we exhale the last time. John's many stories tell about Jesus offering this living relationship as eternal life to Nicodemus, as living water to the women at the well, as bread of life to the crowd gathered on a hillside. Now this promise made to Martha supersedes the other, because now Jesus names the greatest threat to life and our full enjoyment of a relationship with God: death. And Jesus tells us our lives are neither reckoned nor overshadowed by death's inevitability. Instead, we receive a powerful and irrevocable message, a promise: God conquers death. For Jesus declares, whoever has faith in me, even if he should die, shall live. Whoever lives and has faith in me more certainly does not die throughout the age. With this promise, our imaginations get open to a vision of life where you and I remain in the full presence of God during life and after death. In another New York Times piece, Kate Bowler wrote, "A tragedy is like a fault line. A life is split into a before and an after. And most of the time, the before seems so much better. Few people will allow you to admit that out loud, but when they do, they make a little space for me to stand there in the moment." Then Kate goes on to describe the little, ordinary, and gentle ways love has been expressed to her. She calls such moments anchors that hold me in the present. Especially noted are the voices God uses to reassure her of love and life, like the voice of Sister Maria, who on a very bad day told Kate, "Yes, the world is changed, dear heart, but do not be afraid. You are loved. You are loved. You will not disappear. I am here." Jesus makes it so clear. God has denied death power over you. The proclamation is what we preach and what we practice. It is the ultimate work of the church. So friends, let us continue to endeavor to think deeply what this means for the resurrection to be real in our lives and rightly embrace it for ourselves, for our families, for our neighbors, that you are loved. You are loved. Amen. Lord Jesus, amongst all of us here gathered this morning, you know we need to hear that statement of your love, especially some who are grieving or struggling with illness. As you unbound Lazarus, unbound us. Set us free in the knowledge that in this moment there is life. Life you call abundant because it's lived in the reality we are loved. Amen.